My name is Marcia Eli. On behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, and the Center for Brooklyn History, this beautiful building, it's my privilege to welcome you. Tonight's program explores important truths about racism, the direct and indirect gains that result for white Americans, and the corresponding losses for all. Tracie McMillan's new book, The White Bonus: 5 Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America, asks, if racism denies people of color as much as it does, just how much does it give to white people in literal dollars and cents? We're really honored to have Tracie here tonight, along with one of the country's leading experts on federal wealth redistribution, Professor Darrick Hamilton. We're also very happy to have Tracie's book, The White Bonus, at the CBH shop, which you may have seen as you came in over here. Following the conversation, she'll be signing books at the table in the front, and I urge you to read and buy this very important, wonderful book. Tracie McMillan has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Mother Jones, Harper's Magazine, Slate, and National Geographic. She trained under legendary reporter Wayne Barrett, and she was the managing editor of the award-winning magazine City Limits from 2001 to 2005. In addition to The White Bonus, Tracie authored the bestseller The American Way of Eating, and she also has a special claim to fame as a one-time target of Rush Limbaugh. Leading her in conversation tonight is Darrick Hamilton, founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School, where he is Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy. Professor Hamilton's scholarship examines the causes and consequences of racial and ethnic economic disparities and the remedies that address these inequalities. He's been profiled in the New York Times, Mother Jones, Bloomberg's Business Week, and the Wall Street Journal. He was named a Freedom Scholar by the Marguerite Casey Foundation and the Group Health Foundation. He's been involved in crafting policy proposals that have inspired proposed legislation at the federal, state, and local levels, including baby bonds, guaranteed income, and a federal job guarantee. He has testified before several Senate and House committees, including the Joint Economic Committee and the Senate Banking Committee. He is also a member of the Reparations Commission for New York State, recently appointed. And last but definitely not least, he was born and raised in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. So please help me welcome Tracie McMillan and Darrick Hamilton to the stage.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening. So I'm excited by this conversation. I'm going to lead with accolades for this magnificent book that took bravery and integrity. And frankly, that's the way we should always lead any scholarly endeavor, with some willingness to say important things despite potential consequences, but certainly grounded with some integrity and righteousness. I'll say the book addresses a subject area that when we think about white privilege, it's an aspect of privilege that I don't think is so commonly known, which is the capability of going through society with a raceless identity, to not have to interrogate your position as it relates to transaction or even status. I know that many of us with marginalized identities, we constantly have to interrogate transactions, whether they're grounded in race or not, with a lens of, is this because of my race? So, I think, and modern scholarship, this certainly ranks amongst the leaders in acknowledging that point and unveiling the truth behind white people have an identity, and that identity is not some neutral entity, but actually garners a certain type of privilege. So I'm going to lead with the first question, which is, what is the white bonus? What is the white bonus and how does it work?
Yeah, so thank you again for doing this, Darrick. I'm a huge fan of his scholarship. The white bonus, very roughly, right? It's like a rough back of the envelope estimate of money that white folks get or save as a result of white supremacy in policy or private practice, right? So that's sort of if it was in a dictionary, that's roughly what the definition would say. I felt like as I was going through my life and my reporting and my work, and certainly through the 2010s, right, I just realized that I really did not understand anything about how being white shaped my sort of material life, but I knew there was something there, right? The first book I did, I worked undercover in 3 jobs in the food system, and to write that book, I had to study sort of why am I being treated the way I am in these different workplaces. And in 2 of the 3 places I worked, I was the only white woman employed, right? And so constantly I was sort of like, oh, I got a ride to the other side of the orchard at the end of the day in 105-degree heat. My other coworkers did not get that. Why is that happening? Right? And sort of that opened up that idea. And then as I'm going through the 20-teens, and I'm like, really does seem like racism is continuing to be a problem. Like maybe I could figure out something that would be useful to do without taking up space that could very readily be occupied by a writer or journalist of color, right? Because I think about representation in media a lot. So I didn't want to do a project where, going out and like writing a story, as I did early in my career, about how difficult it is to live on welfare in New York City, right? That doesn't need to be done by me necessarily. And I write about this in the white bonus. I think often my early work really suffered from this myopia of not understanding race and racism really at all, right? And so I was reporting on low-income people of color, and nothing in my life or my profession was requiring me to understand better sort of the people that I was reporting on, right? So I sort of came to feel, I don't think you have to be the same race as the people that you are reporting on, but you need to have like a deep knowledge and respect and appreciation for the community you're reporting on. And I didn't have that, right? So the white bonus, this idea that you could try to quantify white advantage, for me was about sort of shifting the conversation and also giving us something to grab onto. I think so often conversations around white privilege are very amorphous, right? Sort of like this ghosty thing, and you sort of try to grab onto it, it shape shifts and it's over there, and all of a sudden you're talking about class privilege or like able-bodied privilege, and what even is privilege, and if you have a dollar figure, right? At least then the debate is like, what is the amount, as opposed to does it even exist?
You actually put forth a number. What is your white bonus, and unpack it?
Sure. So as I moved through it, like when I started the project, I was like, okay, well, what I'm gonna do is I'll just sort of look at like how much money have I or any of my subjects, right? The book has 4 other subjects besides me, but how much money have I gotten from my family since I turned 18, or left, for me it was left home, right? Because I left home at 17. And how likely is it they would have had that money if they weren't white, right? As I went through the project, I realized that there's also sort of what I call a social bonus that I'm getting as an adult out in the world, right? So there's sort of the money from my family and whether or not it's derived from, in part, racist policies, but then also whether or not racist policies are giving me advantages when I'm out in the workforce and the world on my own. So the family bonus, right, the number I came up with, and I will say this is adjusted for inflation, right, was $146,000. And so, if you get the book, there's like dollars and cents, right? But like about $146,000 over 30 years, right? So it's not all at once. And what was really interesting to me is that, the more powerful bonus is the social stuff, right? The doors that get opened for me in the workforce and in housing, and things like that once I'm out in the world. So the number for that is like 225,000, I think, right? Much bigger. I will say that one also includes the fact that, white supremacy and racism sort of ruined Detroit's housing market and put it on super sale, which meant I was able to buy a house, right, and build equity. So like the equity number, right, for the house that I have is, at the time when I was doing the appendix, was like $150,000, right? So a bunch of that 225 is actually just this thing where it's like racism put the city on super sale in a lot of ways, and then, right, that trickles down to me.
I mean, two big components. One is just straight up physical capital, finance transfers that one could trace back and you painstakingly do to policies in American history that included some and excluded others. And the other one, the sociologists in the room would call social capital. That it's not some neutral entity when you're in certain networks that you get privileged towards a job or having access to an apartment listing, whatever. But we take these things for granted.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's bring it to Brooklyn. So we're in Brooklyn. We're in this historic building. Little personal narratives. I grew up in Brooklyn, and when I'm going away to college, Tracie arrives, and I'm jealous. I'm spending my 20s away from Brooklyn. She's here, but thinking about Brooklyn, you moved to Brooklyn in 1996, 19-year-old, into a rent-stabilized apartment. And in the book, you write about how that was part of your white bonus. Dissect that, access to that apartment.
Sure. So, and actually my roommate, Oscar, is here from that era. So when I was in college, right, and I write about this in the book, right, I have a sort of falling out with my parents. It's a very fraught relationship. And so at 19, I'm like on my own, got to take care of myself in New York. And the white bonus sort of operates on a couple of levels here. So first, I had a job for a wealthy white family in Manhattan, and they offered to co-sign for me. And this is a job where the woman told me, and I will say, this woman was lovely. It was a great job. I had a very good experience there. But she told me, she's like, well, I know this is a weird job because you don't have to work very hard at it, which was true. But, my kids are never going to have to work, and they need to know somehow that people do, right? Which is what I was there, part of what I was there for. And that was not the only thing, right? She did need someone to be at home with her kids, but she had put herself through college. So she sort of had this mobility because she married a wealthy person. And so she wanted her kids to sort of see that, they're going to, Little Red Schoolhouse and Elizabeth Irwin and St. Anne's. And like, she wanted them to see that the kids that looked like their classmates, some people had to work, right? So that's like, and I think that I had to be white for that to happen, right? So you get that. So ching, I get into the job. So then when I'm looking for an apartment, right, as a 19-year-old with like $700 in savings, and, I'm not from New York, I don't have family here or anything, having a hard time getting an apartment. And so finally we find, Oscar and I find an apartment way out in Sunset Park where they're like, yeah, we'll rent to you if you get someone to co-sign in New York. Right, so I was complaining about this to my boss. I did not expect her to offer, but she was like, oh, my husband can sign that for you. And I was like, oh. And I write about this in the book, right? He's a very powerful, political operative. And, the co-signing form wanted him to put his social security number on it. And he was like, I'm not doing that. If they have a problem, they can call me. And I was like, I didn't know you didn't have to fill out the form all the time, right? And so then you're also like, okay, well, that's all great, but at the same time, right, it's 1996, so rent regulations in New York had recently changed, right? Landlords had been successful in getting, it was vacancy decontrol, and some changes that weakened the law, so that every time you got a new tenant onto a lease or like a completely new tenancy altogether, you could increase the rent by 20%. And then once it got up, I think at the time if it got up to $2,000, it would be deregulated entirely. So if you were a landlord that wanted to be able to charge market rent for your apartments, the sort of easiest legal thing to do would be to bring broke college students that didn't look like the neighborhood and probably would sort of cycle through really quickly, right? So, at the time I understood this as like, these landlords are being really kind to me, right? But there was a real material reason for them to give a white girl from Michigan, right, who is broke, probably not going to stick around, an apartment, because as soon as we left, they could jack up the rent by 20%.
The subjects of your book and the framing is not around the wealthy. My conception, or what the general conception might be of white privilege, would be, what would be the face of white privilege? Elon Musk, Donald Trump. We think of the monopoly man. Why the middle class?
I mean, basically just because, right, I'm not Elon Musk, and I was like, I know that so just the, right, I can't write about Elon Musk. He's not going to talk to me. I had this idea initially with the book. I was like, I'm going to report up and down the class ladder. I'm going to find really broke white people. I'll get, a really rich white person and have some folks in the middle. And as I went through the reporting process, like, the only people I could get to talk to me were folks in the middle class. And I think that's because there's just a much clearer understanding of how tenuous stability is there, and not as much shame, right? Because if you're broke, right, that in our society can often be sort of, people don't want to talk about it. And then as I went through the reporting on the bigger policy and history stuff, I was like, this is actually really important, because I didn't know how to talk about white privilege in a way that felt like I was also having to pretend like I was like Elon Musk, right? So like going to NYU in the 90s, right, I would have like kids who, whose parents did pay for college, who did go on European vacations, right, who did have all those advantages, sort of talk to me about my white privilege. And that's just a lot to swallow when you're like passing out because you're not eating enough, right? And so for me, figuring out how do we talk about white advantage in a way that serves racial justice but doesn't ignore class, right, and sort of class oppression, that was really important. And so it just sort of evolved into being, there's 5 families in the book, including mine, and it goes from like the daughter of a union construction worker in Pittsburgh, right, on up to, I think probably the most affluent is Barb, who was, and I think actually Debbie and her family, right, are here. So, hi Debbie. So Barb's sister Debbie is here. That family, right, had like a very affluent grandfather who was like a founder of a synagogue and things like that.
Well, let's stay on the white middle class a little bit. And are there lessons learned over time about that demographic that might shed light on the dynamics of America or racism in general? I guess the white middle class of perhaps your grandfather's generation versus today, any insights about different conditions and how it might translate into the white bonus or not?
Yeah. Well, I think, with my grandparents, there was just a lot more public investment in sort of America created a middle class, right, in the early to mid 20th century, which is what my grandparents were able to benefit from, right? And so, government with the GI Bill and FHA, GI Bill covering college, right? So college was basically free with the GI Bill at that time, right? So like my grandparents, they were basically just handed like, just step on the escalator and you're going to end up in the middle class, right? Super easy, right? I remember my grandparents, one was a banker, one set was like factory workers. The factory workers, those were not super sophisticated financial whizzes, right? Like good people, but they just got their union job and they got some education and like they were able to have like a really nice middle class house and put kids through college and it was fine, right? And now, right, in part because white voters have been so consistently hostile to investment when they think that people who aren't white are going to get it, right, means that increasingly, nobody's getting it, right? So we start out with, we're making an investment and we're going to like deny that to people of color, and instead of expanding to incorporate like these communities that were unfairly left out, right, what white voters have tended to support is just being like, no, not like now none of us are going to get this.
Yeah, Ira Katz-Nelson aptly titles his book of this, when affirmative action was white, and then he goes painstakingly through all the details of these policies. So, a key feature is a white middle class, particularly as it relates to wealth, didn't just emerge. It was public policy. Public policy that we all, or at least some of us, might say was great public policy. Down payment assistance to get into home ownership, Social Security, right? Social Security originally, when it was legislated, excluded domestic and agricultural workers. Well, who were they? Black women and black men. Over 90% of black women employed were employed as a domestic or agricultural worker when Social Security was passed, and over half of black men. Yeah. So you have these seemingly race-neutral policies that in their design, management, and implementation were racist. But they were successful, so there's silver linings in generating a class of people that didn't exist prior. So then now we fast forward and we're in what some people might call a neoliberal period, where we're divesting in investments in people in a more direct way that some people call a social safety net. And is it flaming racism? Does that anxiety, does that despair amongst a white population who unfairly might have been used to a position of privilege and status, does that loss of not only absolute standing, does that enhance a desire to want to double down on your relative position, right? That, if you want to elaborate or anything, just feel free.
I'll just solve it. I think about this a lot, and because I've been trying to think through, what does the work that I'm doing right now, how does that tie into what we're seeing in American politics right now, right? With the emergence of very open, overt racism. And I just think that, the reason it's so important to try and figure out how to talk about something like the white bonus is because white people don't understand. We are taught not to understand that there was a bonus, right? We think about the GI Bill as just like what people get. I actually had a podcast host say to me, but that's just what Americans get. It's nothing special. It's like, well, it's special if you were denied it, right? If you weren't given access to it, because that's government making an active decision to help some people and not others. But because sort of overall, right, white folks don't even see that they got something, right? So you sort of get raised up in American culture and society. And you're like, well, I just have what's normal. That's just normal. Nobody gave me anything. And then when people start talking about, well, we need to do something for black people because of, this historic difference, and again, this is a general statement, but white people are like, but I didn't get anything special. Why do we give something special to these other people, right? And which is completely ahistorical and not accurate, but we really do set up most white people for that, right? I would not understand any of this if I hadn't gone to a liberal arts college at a private university, right? And only a third of people in the U.S. even go to college, let alone study history.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you don't reduce the book to caricatures, that there's some depth in people. It's not simply white, bad, black, good. You give clarity of the bonus and the privilege, but in what ways and how do your narratives relate to ways in which racism in general is negative for all of us?
Yeah, so I think the clearest example of that is actually Barb Nathan Katz, right? Who's the fourth profile, and so her sister's here and was very generous. The Nathans were very generous in talking with me about this. So right, the sort of thumbnail sketch is that Barb is born into a solid middle class family in Houston in mid-century. She falls into working poverty as an adult. She's married to a guy that I will say, based on the reporting I did, I would say was most likely had a mental illness. I mean, it seemed like a very sort of out there person. And so it ends up being this situation where Barb is supporting the two of them on wages from IHOP, right, in a suburb outside of Dallas. She's going through life Affordable Care Act comes in, right? So many places in the country, right, got expanded Medicaid to working age adults without children, which is what Barb was. But Texas did not, right? And very clear social science and political science on opposition to Medicaid expansion under the ACA being closely tied to white racism. So there's no Medicaid expansion in Texas, and Barb, is older and she starts getting sick. She develops diabetes, but she doesn't know it. And so she dies, right? I mean, people die all the time because we don't have these things in place. And I think white people, again, with a broad brush, like the sort of political assumption is that like, well, like I'm not going to need those services, that's for somebody else, like it, or to be very punitive, having punitive policies like work requirements, which as a welfare reporter, I think are like the scourge of the earth, right? Having these things to prove that people deserve basic things like healthcare, right? And that ends up hurting everybody. White people are taught to think that the people who are hurt are not us, but that's not true. And I will say I didn't really understand it so much when I was starting this book, but I mean, my mother died for a very similar reason, right? And so this is something that just keeps hurting people again and again. And for me, it's part of the power of talking about the white bonus is then it also opens up a conversation about, well, what does it cost us also to let racism just sort of go unfettered or act like it's not our concern, right? And I feel like, certainly the Nathans, right, saw a huge loss, right? And this is something that it's not even that like I myself will be fine, because there's a lot of middle-class white people who will probably get through everything just fine. But most of us are going to know somebody who gets really hurt because we don't have a real safety net, right? We're going to know young people who get sucked into like terrible student debt, right? We're going to know people who die because we don't have public health care. We're going to know people who have serious problems staying housed, right? So even if individually we're safe, I think it's increasingly clear that there's a lot of risk built into our economy right now because we keep having these fights over like who deserves what.
Yeah. I mean, the question, does racism make us worse off or better off? Clearly, it makes Black people worse off, right? But your book, which I like, points out the potential ambiguity of that question for white people when values defined in a certain way. So on the one hand, there are clear examples of privilege that can translate into material outcomes. But on the other hand, there's public policy that may have existed otherwise that we'll never get. So, and that we all absolutely could have been better off. So it becomes somewhat of a contextual, empirical question. However, you also raised the term of impoverished democracy. And if we were to define value beyond self-interested accumulation and talk about things like impoverished democracy and other characteristics that are just as human to us as accumulation of resources, I think it becomes unambiguous at that point. I think if we were to define and can get to a point of defining society in a more moralistic term, a more human term, a more sustainable term, that might be the game changer, right? And I'll say this, and I should have let this off where this should be conversational. So feel free to make it 360. You don't have to be on the hot seat, but a key point. Marcia led this conversation off describing that she characterized my work as causes, consequences, and then here's the part we all should be focused on as well: remedies. What can we do, right? It behooves us to kind of come up with strategies and approaches where we can achieve justice. So this last question leads me to the new R word, not racism, but reparations.
Right.
What are your thoughts on reparations as pathway forward, and are there potential pitfalls?
Right. I mean, for me, the thing that I came out of this book feeling is I was like, oh, we definitely owe something, right? Like, I don't have any ambiguity about that, right? We have spent a lot of resources to help white people, right? Not even just like talking about like reparations, particularly for enslavement, right? But just the stuff in the 20th century, right? Like, we very explicitly created benefits that we only gave to white people. We should be making sure that everybody gets access to that stuff. For me, that's like the core thing. The specifics of how do you do it and all of that, I'm like, that is above my pay grade, right? But I really, because I keep getting asked, like, well, then what do we do? How do we solve this? And I'm like, work to end racism, right? And sort of be involved in our democracy and making things better wherever we can, right? Because, one thing that I talk about a little bit is, I live on the edge of Clinton Hill and Bed-Stuy, and about 10 years ago, a friend of mine was dating a bar owner in the neighborhood, and like by happenstance, I end up going out with him for drinks one night to like go check out another bar, right? Because that's what he does. That's his like work, right? So we go, and we're talking about, whatever, just bullshitting at the bar, and it's very attractive wait staff. And I said something about how I was like, oh, I'll totally spend more money for attractive people to bring me drinks. That's totally a thing. And he turns to me, he's like, yeah, I totally discriminate. I was like, one time, like I went to Madiba and this beautiful woman brought me drinks. Like, he was like, yeah, I don't hire black people. And I was like, it's very embarrassing to me now because I was like, I probably didn't hear him correctly. Allow me to like push, right? And I actually, so we like get through this conversation. And I'm like, he seems like he really means it, right? And then I went out with him a second time because he was my ride home and it was 1 a.m. And so I didn't argue super hard with him, but then I felt really bad about it, right? So I like called my friends who were attorneys and I was like, well, what can I do? And they were like, unless it's like 50 employees, it's not covered by EOC, and you'd have to get, like, the people who are getting discriminated against have to, like, do something about it. Like, you could, there's not a lot that you individually could do, and this is before I understood Twitter also. And so part of me is now like, just like my little thing that I try to pay attention to is like when I'm going out in Brooklyn, which I don't do a ton because it costs money, but like when I go out, I'm just like, well, does it look like they have equitable hiring practices? And like there are people of color who are like they're hanging out. And I don't mean like there's a table full of white hipsters and there's one black person with them. I mean, like, are there groups of people who aren't white hanging out together, right? Because they feel comfortable. Because, right, this particular bar, right, I started my own little whisper campaign with people being like, don't go there. Like, don't go there. And I was talking to a black friend of mine about this bar, and they were like, before I explained what I knew about this bar, they were like, yeah, I never go there. Like, I've been there a couple of times. I'm always the only black person there. And I was like, there is a reason for that, right? So there's even like that little stuff. But, I started doing a lot more work for my tenant organization in Brooklyn because it's a 48-unit building. I'm the only white person in the building. I'm also the only person that management seems to respond to consistently with complaints, right? So just sort of being like, how do we work together, right? Not me just doing service for my neighbors, which I'm happy to do some of, but like working to build a tenant organization together so that we can get what we need out of them.